how genetic engineering, like we've engineered our major food crops to withstand huge amounts of herbicide. We blasted so much, and every weed scientist that wasn't on the payroll of these pesticide companies was flagging that you can't do this, you're going to create resistance. And of course, that's exactly the business plan of these companies. And so they're selling more and more weed killer, and then they're stacking more and more resistance traits. So now the most recent crop in the regulatory pipeline is engineered to withstand 5 different herbicides. You know, the Bayer Monsanto, I forgot whatever it's called. And it's just, wow, it's so clear. I mean, what journalists, like, that's the story.
Welcome to the Real Organic Podcast. I'm Linley, Dixon, co-director of the Real Organic Project. We're a grassroots, farmer-led movement with an add-on organic food label, distinguishing organic crops grown in healthy soils and organic livestock that is raised on well-managed pasture. You just heard from David Bronner, the CEO, or Cosmic Engagement Officer, at Dr. Bronner's Soap Company. David is also one of the early adopters and architects of Regenerative Organic certification, which is the story he'll be sharing with us today. We know that many of you have questions about how ROC and Real Organic Project are different and why these two movements didn't just join forces and become one from the onset. The biggest difference worth mentioning is that Real Organic Project is farmer-led, which many of us felt was vitally important in certification. If you have other questions about how our organizations differ and where we sometimes overlap, please feel free to post them on our YouTube channel.
So welcome everybody to the Real Organic Podcast, and I'm talking again with my friend David Bronner out here in Vista, California. David, we've talked for some years now, and I asked to talk again. Our symposium this year is going to be addressing the question that's come up a lot, actually, to me. I get people asking all the time now, is organic regenerative? And the second question I get is regenerative organic?
Yeah.
And, you know, it's become huge because there's been such a massive embrace of the term regenerative by the corporate giants who define big ag and big food.
Mm-hmm.
And this has happened in breathtaking speed, as I'm sure you've been watching.
Yeah.
So I think you're one of the people who has thought the most about this, and I'd like to ask you, if you could, to start, you know, you're one of the founders of the Regenerative Organic certification.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me a little bit of the creation myth. How did that come to be? Whose idea was that? What happened?
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that question, I think we agree, and I think a lot of people agree with us, that are true organic farmers and true regenerative farmers, which means that organic should mean regenerative and regenerative should mean organic. And unfortunately, the reality is that when organic became enshrined as a set of regulations, that the spirit of organic was often lost, and increasingly as big corporate players came in, and organic regs are kind of more about what you shouldn't be doing, like you shouldn't use this synthetic fertility or that synthetic pesticide, but it wasn't codifying what you should be doing, which is whether regenerative, like, you know, what you should be doing in an organic farm is doing regenerative practices, you know, organic practices that, you know, there's a lot of overlap, but, you know, cover cropping and nitrogen fixing cover crops and smart grazing practices and smart rotations where you understand, you know, what's a heavy nitrogen feeder and, you know, what can fix it, you know, nitrogen before that and match that with market demands. And, you know, it's complex, but, you know, perimeter plantings for pollinators and predatory insects for insect control. You know, there's just a lot of things that go into a real good organic farm, a really good regenerative farm, a really good biodynamic farm. I mean, they're all terms that should mean a farm that's an organism. It's understood that it's living, and you're generating fertility on the farm. You're not bringing fertility in from off farm. So unfortunately, a lot of the big organic corporate farms, is kind of, instead of synthetic nitrogen, they're just bringing CAFO manures in by the truckload. Just kind of input substitution. They're not really doing the regenerative practices on their farm and building carbon in the soil and doing the things that good organic farmers do. And then regenerative, on the regenerative side, is this term that should also mean, regenerative, means building carbon in the soil, is, I guess, how a lot of people define it, but it should also mean, building fertility on your farm without relying on synthetic fertility. To me, that's like definition one of regenerative. And if you're not doing that, if you're bringing in a synthetic fertility, then that's a contradiction. And especially when we're talking about climate change and addressing climate change. So it's like a real joke to me when, regenerative people who are adopting that moniker are relying on synthetic fertility, since nitrogen fertilizer is like the number one greenhouse gas, both in the creation of it and then in its downstream effects, is the number one contributor in agriculture to climate change. So to be in a regenerative, quote unquote, system and rely on synthetic fertility is, that's ridiculous. And so I think regenerative and organic should go together. And in fact, the really good organic farmers are regenerative. And so the genesis, the creation story for regenerative organic is we started to see organic increasingly kind of go sideways. And it was, the really good organic farmers were competing against these huge CAFOs and huge corporate farms, and they were, kind of inside the letter of the law, but violating the spirit. And so the regenerative organic standard was a way to address that, and basically a shrine, not just what you don't do, but what you should be doing on a farm. And just kind of bringing the practices that good organic farmers are already doing and enshrining that in regulation. And then also bringing in high-level animal welfare criteria. Again, a good organic farmer is doing a more pasture-based system, so codifying pasture-based livestock in regulation. And then on the social fairness side, making sure that the labor on a farm is treated fairly, is safe, is well compensated, or decently compensated. And so just kind of bringing the best of soil health and fair labor and animal welfare into a single consumer-facing standard. And
yeah. So okay. So, and you can't help but walk around your company, Dr. Bronner's, and your commitment to social welfare, both of the people who work here and the people outside of the company that you're trying to serve, the people of the planet. It's very obvious, and it's everywhere. That commitment is everywhere, and I making a call out here because I really respect it. It seems like the things that you describe as organic and you're using the term regenerative, but actually they're just organic. I mean, those were the things that organic meant when it began.
Yeah,
all of those practices.
Yeah. That's where they came from, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And the first time that I've heard of the term regenerative being used applied to agriculture was by Bob Rodale.
Yeah.
Did you ever meet him?
I didn't.
Yeah.
But Jeff sent me some of his original writings, and yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, that it was termed out of the organic movement. So
What do you think he was trying to get at? Bob, do you think, you've read some of his writings, what was he trying to get at when he used that term regenerative? Because really he started to use it, I think it was just maybe 2 years after the Organic Food Production Act passed. So it was really early in the growth of organic, and there was something that he was trying to get at. What do you think that was? What was getting lost?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the way he meant it, as far as practically on the ground, was that the soil, you leave the soil better than when you found it. Like every year, the soil is benefiting from your agricultural practice. You're making it more healthy, you're building the microbiota and making it even more awesome. Versus like treading water with quote unquote sustainability. And I think to your point, or even like obeying the letter of the law, but your soil is now kind of starting to go to crap, and you're reliant on more and more off-farm inputs to bring your crops to market, and you're kind of cashing in on the organic program without actually doing the practices that truly regenerate soil, regenerate rural economies, regenerate livelihoods.
You know, when I interviewed Gary Hirschberg for our milk session last year from Stonyfield, and he knew Bob, and he walked around the fields with him. He said he thought that Bob Rodale's idea was really, for him, regenerative was more about bringing back social justice to the organic movement, because he thought that was the piece that was maybe getting lost. In the beginning, there was still, everything about the soil was still there, and everything about animal welfare was still there, but in the law, in the Organic Food Production Act, there really wasn't anything about the social justice that was very much a part of the organic movement.
Yeah.
Before it got to law.
Yeah, well said. And I know Jeff, at Rodale now, I mean, he often says, like, treating the earthworms with respect is, not enough. And we got to make sure the farm workers and that makes sense that Bob Rodale was speaking in the regenerative lingo to encompass the social welfare piece. And you're right. I mean, the organic movement, when it was a movement, was a holistic program of, not just land management and agriculture, but treating people right and being in relationship with your customers who understood that they're paying a premium for food that was grown right, paying a price that enabled you to take care of your land and your people in the right way. And
yeah. Well, when I was young, and I graduated high school in '71. It was the very last year of Vietnam, and all of that turmoil and ferment and the movement that grew out of that did change America. Organic at that point was very much a political movement, and I don't mean Democrats or Republicans. I mean it was political in a sense of trying to change how we lived, how we relate to each other, how we relate to the earth, how we relate to food. All those things were kind of up on the table saying we need a different way.
Yeah.
That's what the Real Organic Project is trying to do, and I believe that's what Regenerative Organic Certification is also trying to do, the same thing in that.
Yeah, right. It's a much more of a commitment to a global view of social and economic and ecological welfare.
Yeah.
Not just looking at it as like some piece that you do sometimes. Sometimes we'll do that. Sometimes we're going to, do whatever. But that it's a, whole life commitment to a different way of living. That, I think. Yeah, I mean, the hope and dream is that globally we can shift, and so much of the energy flows on the planet is like through the human ecosystem and our human, directly through our mouths and through our beings, and just the world that we're creating out there, and complicit with these corporations that want to keep us ignorant, and a lot of us don't really want to know, just really, just not don't want to be bothered. But it's just creating a disaster and on the world, and I mean the movement. Yeah, I mean it was a movement like we want to change. We want to transform that. We want to transform and live a simpler lifestyle in harmony with the earth and each other. And
So when this started, when the Regenerative Organic Certification began, who went to who? I'm just curious. Did you go to Rodale in Patagonia, or did Jeff go?
You know what? There is like a pretty spicy online, just kind of debate going on, and between organic and it was like different kind of people inside the regenerative tent. we're very critical of organic in that in the way real organic is, and we are, and just kind of pointing to over tillage and reliant on capable manures and not built, critiquing how do you say corporate organics, but then conflating that with real organic, or like trying to like lump everyone together and not like acknowledging real organic, and then vice versa. Aaron Stevens and Jeff, myself, Rose, saying, okay, like, so awesome, you're very good critique there, but if a regenerative quote unquote farm is reliant on synthetic fertility and nitrogen and is making climate change, I mean, it is ridiculous and hypocrisy, totally hypocritical, and regenerative needs to be organic. And especially an herbicide, when you're burning down with Roundup is your no-till strategy. And, it's just like, this is not regenerative vision, and it's internally contradictory. It's just not, if you're using synthetic fertility and Roundup, I mean, that's not regenerative. And so it was basically a way of like kind of seeing that regenerative was going to go the way of sustainability, and that there was also hope of kind of rescuing organic in a way, of like putting it together. So I guess kind of a few of us, I think, organically. And it was Rose from Patagonia and Jeff from Odell, myself. I think we're the kind of initial seed.
And that grew out of an online dialogue or debate of exchange of ideas. I imagine that got a bit heated sometimes.
Heated, and then, but there are so many good points on all sides. You know, and in the blog I wrote, Regenitarians Unite, and I do. I mean, Gabe is a superhero. I mean, I think he's doing a lot of amazing things, and as are other individuals, and I think we all can learn from each other. But ultimately, it needs to come together in regenerative organic vision. And but it was Rose, me and Jeff, and then we brought in Dana Geffner from Farewell Project. Leah Garces from Compassion Rural Farming. She's now moved on to Mercy for Animals, but Compassion Rural Farming was a real partner on the animal welfare side, and has been doing really good work on the GAP, Global Animal Partnership Development, and just promoting better, more humane livestock practices, but not in this like total vegan, all livestock is wrong. It's much more like there's good and bad, and we're about promoting the good, and so they were just really good in coming in and helping us define the pasture-based livestock criteria, and which mostly honestly are, and we've got our criteria, but mostly we rely on third-party certifications. It was more like, okay, who meets a bar, because there's so much crap out there, so it's just like, okay, we're gonna say animal welfare approved, we're gonna say certified humane pasture level. There's like 2 levels at certified humane, and then GAP 4 and above. That's kind of like where the center of gravity is on the animal welfare side. And then on the fair labor, relying on mostly existing high bar fair trade certifications for international, but realizing pretty soon that domestically there really wasn't a viable partner, or that had any real traction or kind of workability. So then we just developed our own, and have been working through the pilot to refine that and make it work for farmers, but still be meaningful, obviously, for farm workers who are the primary stakeholder. And
yeah, that's great. Okay. So back then it was a discussion, that online debate that got spicy, and as you say, that there were really well-meaning people on both sides of that debate. And when I first heard of the regenerative movement, and it was a Midwestern thing, and it was described to me that it was tribal, that those people would never become organic because they would be embarrassed to be organic because it was not part of their culture. Mm-hmm. And it was like, nobody would speak to them at the coffee shop anymore if they were organic, which is true. We certify lots of Midwestern organic farms, and
they get ostracized. Yeah.
Man, they get ostracized. they get vandalized.
Wow.
People won't talk to them anymore, passing them on the street. It's intense. We forget on the coasts that there's a big middle America, and being organic is perceived as being an assault on somebody's way of life.
Yeah.
And that way of life is there's all this hidden persuasion of who we are, and I think it's often very calculated by corporations who are making a lot of money off that system, but they're very effective at persuading people that somehow it's un-American to be organic.
Yeah. No, totally.
And it's a terrible thing, because it closes down that doorway which those companies are terrified of.
Yeah.
Because they make their money selling chemicals and fertilizers to those farmers. That's exactly how they make their money.
Yeah, no, you're getting at something pretty key here, and I mean, honestly, like kiss the ground. So it's like a thing here where, and Gabe, I mean, it's he's pretty honest. He's like, look, I mean, no chemicals is the goal, but if we call it organic, you're just not, the conversation stops. Like it's more like, it's just bring the regenerative and lower that, hey, you don't need to spend that much money on synthetic nitrogen, kind of put it in these economic terms, putting it into this organic philosophy of less harm on the earth, and how do we, it's more in the economic interest, and more in that frame, and don't talk about climate change too much, and like,
Right.
you know what I mean? It's like a different conversation, but in a way they're trying to move people along a path. And
Well, now they like to talk about climate change in the Midwest, because they're about to get billions of dollars from the government.
Right.
It's so we'll talk about that. But I heard Ray Archuleta being interviewed by Al Gore. I told you about that conference, and Ray said something that was so interesting to me. He said, I used to try and take on the chemical companies. I used to tell the farmers, you need to use less chemicals. And he said, I never made any progress. But since I started talking about regenerative, I'm making lots of progress, because it's actually no longer that threatening to those chemical companies. And so they can speak about it as the positive of including, green manures and cover crops, but not necessarily saying you should stop using Roundup.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was so interesting that something better is happening, but at the same time, Bayer Monsanto is winning. When they start to actually sculpt the conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I love Ray, and I think he's
a wonderful guy.
Yeah, and
We all love Ray. I sit and talk to Ray, listen to Ray anytime I get a chance.
No, and I think he definitely wants to, see, he totally sees the problem in a mega way, and the ag chemical stranglehold and ag policy, and we actually financed a film, Dominion, a short film featuring Ray, and he really wanted to talk in a kind of Christian idiom to his fellow farmers, and it's really amazing. And I think it's on the circuit. I was just hearing, it's just kind of surprising, like, oh, you didn't even like show me till, and like I guess it's out and about, but it's pretty rad. It turned out in a really good way, and pretty intense. It's almost like a PETA film actually, but it juxtaposed with like beautiful scenes of like grass-fed, cows, in proper rotation and living a beautiful life, but then juxtaposed with like, wow, man, this is like some hardcore slaughterhouse CAFO footage. Oh my goodness. And so he's doing the good work. But yeah, I think he's just like, okay, how do you take on the machine? You got to kind of like jujitsu it and figure out your path. And
I have great respect for Ray. I have great respect for Gabe, and they're doing great work. But I don't always agree with them.
Yeah. Well, and right. I mean, they're kind of prioritizing like, okay, well, we can get this good. If we can get everyone cover cropping, then that'll be awesome. And if they're still using Roundup, well, at least it's better than before, and I think they're more incremental and trying to, and Gabe's new standard, right? It's kind of like a incremental thing. It's like, you got to make these progresses along the chain. And it's interesting. I haven't actually, it was a while ago, I'm not sure its highest level, but hopefully it's more or less a regenerative organic level of, no chemicals.
What is?
Gabe launched a standard.
Oh, he launched some standards.
Yeah, it's got a standard, and I think it's it's like a year one is 20% of your and then like there's like these like progress goals and stuff, and there's a path, and I think they're and I think they're coming from a culture and understand it and understand, I guess, kind of what you're getting at, that there's like this irrational allergic reaction to organic, and as soon as that's talked about in a certain, I guess, demographic of farmers that maybe dominates, that it shuts down a conversation, so they're navigating it. But ultimately pesticides and herbicides and synthetic fertility, part of you're allowing a term that has a lot of promise and meaning. I mean, it's one thing when we say regenerative practice, there's regenerative practices on a farm that aren't necessarily meaning that farm is regenerative. And that was like the debate, basically. It was like, you can have like good practices, and that's good, and let's incentivize those practices, but let's not call that regenerative agriculture if they're on a path to regenerative agriculture and they've adopted XYZ practice. That farm is not regenerative until you're all the way to you're off synthetic fertility, you're off pesticides, and you're doing all the good stuff. Now it's a regenerative farm.
Yeah.
And that was basically the debate that was happening. It's like conflating practices with like a total holistic result, like conflating the path with the endpoint. Not that there's ever like a true endpoint, but like a practical endpoint of like you're off synthetic fertility and pesticides, you're doing all the regenerative practices. That's regenerative, and that farm is regenerative, but not like, oh, I'm cover cropping and doing some mob grazing, but I'm still cropping and using synthetic nitrogen and using Roundup to burn down the weeds, and and it's like, well, that's not a regenerative farm.
Yeah. It things get tricky when you start to create standards and create a movement and ask people to embrace it. One of the things the reason that we're having this exploration and this symposium is because I get asked so often of, it's become almost an article of faith amongst many non-farmers that all tillage is bad, is evil, and destroys the soil, which I don't think is true at all. I think there's bad tillage, and I think that there's good tillage. And I'm curious because a lot of people have come to embrace this, including some people who are modestly well informed, and they go, organic is great, but the one thing it left out was climate. And I say, really? And how did it leave it out? Well, it still tills. And I go, so you think no-till is the answer for the climate? And they say, yes. And I say, that virtually all no-till is accomplished with herbicides. And they go, what do you mean? There's a roller crimper, isn't there? I said, well, yes, in certain circumstances you can use a roller crimper, but most of no-till is accomplished with
herbicide.
Roundup and so people actually don't know that. They don't understand that.
Yeah, I know. And that, and it's just like, obviously there is, clearly over-tillage, and there are many farms guilty of just over-tilling soil, but minimal soil disturbance is a goal. But I mean, having smart interventions to control weed pressure in doing it with, just what is needed and when it's needed, and being smart about it. Yeah, I mean, the proof's in the pudding. I mean, you can see these organic farms that do it right, and you can just like feel it, and you can measure the soil carbon, and everything is going to be off the Richter, when you're doing it right, and tillage done right is fine. And yeah, and that's what we do with rock, and just say, it's not like no till, it's just like, just be smart about your tillage, and make sure it's part of a overall holistic plan. But yeah, I mean, relying on herbicides, which I wrote a blog. I don't think it was too popular because I think I equally offended everybody, but but it was about, oh man, it was like the New York Times, like they did, I think it was last summer, man. It was like July, and they had this, another front page puff piece on GMOs, and and it was just this ridiculous, right? And there's no real discussion around herbicide tolerant traits, which is the number one thing. I mean, they had some discussion, but it was like in this kind of way, like, oh yeah, that used to be the story back when, but now it's this amazing world of GMOs. It's like, no, it's the same story. It's like herbicide tolerant traits. That's the number one market by far. That's what the game is. Like, you're just shilling for a machine that's got you sold on the whole vitamin rich rice that doesn't commercially exist and has no complete yield drag and no adoption by anybody. And then a month later, after this ridiculous story came out, and there's been different reporters at different times that just kind of swallow this stuff and regurgitate it with like no real thought or investigation. But then a month later, an incredible piece came out in the New York Times about basically the end of herbicide. And it was so well done, and it was about how genetic engineering, like we've engineered our major food crops to withstand huge amounts of herbicide. We blasted so much, and every weed scientist that wasn't on the payroll of these pesticide companies was flagging that you can't do this, you're gonna create resistance. And of course, that's exactly the business plan of these companies. And so they're selling more and more weed killer, and then they're stacking more and more resistance traits. So now the most recent crop in the regulatory pipeline is engineered to withstand 5 different herbicides. The Bayer Monsanto, I forgot whatever it's called. And it's just, wow, it's so clear. I mean, what journalists, like, that's the story. Like, wow, the story that came out a month later, that's the story of GMOs. But it's like, obviously in the course of investigating that, journalist was talking to people, the machine got wind of it, and got an emotion, found the shill at New York Times that's gonna tell their story first, so then there's like this cognitive dissonance. So by the time that the real story drops, people are like, wait, well, I just read on the front page of the New York Times how awesome this stuff is, so and it's just like, you're just like, wow. But yeah, I mean, relying on these herbicides that are just they're not going to work anyways in the next few decades. And but I mean, in the meantime, farmers are buying more and more and more of them because weeds aren't dying because they've evolved resistance. So it's just just playing into the big ag chemical playbook. So yeah, so when regenerative is saying, oh yeah, these herbicides that are wrecking American agriculture are part of our regenerative system, I mean, that's like ridiculous. So yeah. I wrote a blog. I'll send it to you.
So you have a vision of where you hope all this is going to go.
Yeah.
Right. And you've told me, maybe it was in last year's interview, or maybe it was just private conversation, probably when I was having a down moment. You said, Dave, you got to remember, this is generational, because I get depressed sometimes because it feels like we're up against Goliath, and we have a very small slingshot, and it's good to remember. But so your vision of how we might have a different way of feeding ourselves, a different agriculture, and regenerative organic is a central part of that. Real organic is something you support. Even regenerative is a step in the right direction, although it can easily get lost. Mm-hmm. It can become the new sustainable.
Yeah.
Before I ask you for your vision, let me ask you about that. So right now we got Bayer Monsanto and Cargill, and Pepsi and McDonald's and Archer Daniels Midland and Bunge and Syngenta. About every bad player I can think of has embraced the regenerative movement and said that they are working to be a regenerative company, and they completely support it. They mostly, those same companies, say organic is unscientific and really not even worth talking about, because organic gives them no place to sell their products in. And I'm just curious, can regenerative withstand this corporate onslaught of greenwashing?
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I mean, I guess I haven't been paying a whole lot of attention. I mean, I used to obsess about industrial ag and how bad it is, and fought real hard in the GMO fight, and it was awesome. We learned a lot, but I've just been focused on the solution. Let's just put our energy on that, because even if we knock out GMOs, it's not like conventional ag isn't still a disaster, and it's just we need a fundamental shift, and let's put our energy in that direction. And but yeah, so regenerative, I haven't been following it exactly, but I mean, I kind of feel it, and yeah, I remember, I think even when we were marching on the White House with the GMO march, I think that Monsanto had blanketed their ads, probably on purpose, like at all the bus stops and stuff, and yeah, they were kind of adopting this whole regenerative posture. And yeah, man, I mean, I think the corporate co-optation of movements is a tried and true playbook. I think a lot of the regenerative standards out there, I mean, I guess when I say I don't pay attention is because I think we have a mutual feeling that, look, if you're allowing the synthetic fertility and pesticides into the game, then it's a joke. And then especially when it comes to agriculture or animal agriculture, having chickens run around on a pasture that may have great soil health, but you're feeding them GMO corn and soy that came from somewhere else, that's a disaster. I mean, and you have a standard that has no way, it doesn't even try to track that, or, it's just like, oh yeah, the soil in your pasture is awesome, A+, it's like, no, you're not changing anything about the, monocultures of GMO soy and corn that are, the problem. Like that is not, that standard is doing nothing. Yeah, so, right. So, I mean, yeah, that's the inherent problem with these regenerative standards, and they're just kind of looking the other way as far as the impacts of, even if you think in terms of climate change only, of greenhouse gas emission only, it's just they're not even accounting for what is that nitrogen footprint. It's just like, oh, soil carbon, we're going to measure that. Oh, that's going up, so that's great. And it's like, well, if you're doing that in a way that's, you're using synthetic nitrogen that's using more greenhouse gas, or emitting, it's just like, you're not actually even trying to do the calculus because it would show that is not helping the climate, it's going in the wrong direction. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of problems with standards that are allowing the ag chemicals to still be involved, and especially when they're talking about being a strategy for addressing climate change. It's like, that is not a strategy. Like you're allowing the number one greenhouse gas problem in agriculture into your quote unquote regenerative system. So that's a contradiction.
Which is synthetic nitrogen.
Synthetic nitrogen.
Yeah. So, David, I talk to a lot of farmers, but I hear from a lot of eaters too. And honestly, they're trying to understand this. And they lead busy lives like all of us. And I think that's how people get made into heroes, because they're like, would somebody please tell me what to do? Because I don't know. And people want to do the right thing. They do. I think everybody wants to do the right thing. Some people have a very short attention span for that. Could you help an eater out? I say that instead of consumer, because consumer, it makes it seem like you've been engineered to buy things from producers as opposed to someone who's seeking nourishment. So could you help an eater out and say, well, this is complicated? What do you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the degrees of, let's say, least to more effort. I mean, the least effort is like identify like a good co-op or independent natural food store that's committed to partnering with farms and bringing in produce and products that are being produced in a higher vibration, ideally real organic certified or regenerative organic certified. These are newer standards and we're just starting to get traction, but figure out those certified products, I would say preferentially. And then next best is just, knowing that these are local farms supplying the produce, and ideally there's, good diligence being done by that store, and, kind of do some diligence yourself. I think that's incumbent on all the products we buy, that understanding that our primary impact in the world is the food we eat, the products we consume otherwise. Like, what kind of world are we creating? How was that made? What kind of environmental impact? What kind of social impact? And if you're not thinking about that, then it's generally going to not be a good scenario. But if you are thinking about that and doing some diligence, you can find the brands and the farms and the ranches that are doing things in the right way and support them, and just kind of help build this movement, which, to your earlier point, like it can get depressing sometimes. So like let's just show our support and vote with our dollar for the kind of world we want to live in, which is awesome. And when you go visit these farms, you're like, wow, that for like not that much more money on a purchase, I'm like supporting something incredibly awesome. And this farmer is able to take care of their land and their people and their animals in this beautiful way, and create these incredible communities, and which we're losing, this industrial machine, like that's in the corporate takeover of organics. Like it just becomes a different thing, and just becomes much more of a cost price game, and letter of the regulation, not the spirit. So, I would say, buy your food from a cool co-op, do your research, natural food store. Next, a little more effort would be visit farms, get to know the farms in your area, and get onto a, what do you call, when you get a box of vegetables.
Oh, a CSA.
Yeah, get on a CSA with the rad farm. It's an easy way. Like just, we do it. Edit it. Like we're gonna say it like this. Get on a CSA with a rad local farm. Like that's an easy way to just know you're supporting the righteous farm, doing the right thing. And then meat, I think, is really crucial, because I think meat like magnifies things, because it takes that much more plant protein and energy to make the animal to the meat, and it's really important that you make that decision in a good way, and making sure it's like grass-fed only, beef, like ruminants, like making sure they're not being grain-fed or fed corn on a feedlot. That's hugely important. Pasture-raised chicken, just making sure it's a pasture animal coming from a pastured system and not a CAFO. I think that's probably the number one thing, is just like say no to CAFOs. Like just don't do it. And look for, just try to find that righteous farms, and once you do the work, you've done it. I mean, it's not like you got to keep, once you kind of know the farms that are righteous in your area and these are the good brands, it's not that hard, figure out the restaurants that are, unfortunately the farm to table, that's a whole other can of worms, but try to find the right farm to table restaurants that are like doing it for real and sourcing from the local farms in a right way. And we've got a really cool Thai place here. It's at Bird's Eye. It's super good, but it's all organic. It's so refreshing, and then it's all pasture-raised meats and grass-fed beef, and it's rad. And so just figure out who's doing it in the high vibration, righteous way, and patronize those restaurants and stores and farms. And Bronner's, we kind of, if you're a company of a size and can offer a lunch program, you can, we kind of do it for our employees, but like doing it in a way like, okay, here's the farms we're sourcing from, and we do organic, regenerative, plant-based most days, and then once a week we bring in the food truck with grass-fed burgers and stuff like that, which is obviously our most popular day. But the lesson we're doing is like, if it's not righteous, like, you don't need to do it. You can rock on an organic, plant-based diet, and then just, when you know it's a righteous steak, then cool. But otherwise, just say no to CAFO. Yeah.
That's great, David. Yeah, that's a lot of suggestions that are quite doable for people, right? Not for everybody, and people are in different situations.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
let me ask that. Okay, it's a question that
totally
the bad guys love to hit us with, right? Yeah, but that food costs more, right? What about people who can't afford it? And it always sort of triggers me, because the people saying it are, all they're interested in is making money. They're not interested in feeding poor people. They're interested in making as much money as they possibly can. And we know that making cheap food, paying farmers very little for it, so that they're often in a situation where they can't pay farm help what they ought to pay. And it becomes a vicious circle, and you've got people working on farms and they're on food stamps because they can't afford to buy food. It's crazy. And for them to be able to afford that means food would cost a little bit more. Yeah. And so I'm just curious, do you have thoughts about how you would address it? Seems to me there's a confusion between good quality food and social equity and basically eradicating poverty. Mm-hmm. And they're actually two different issues.
Yeah, totally. And actually we work with Friends of the Earth on their work to shift school system cafeteria meals here in California and elsewhere to organic, and part of that means you're eating less meat, but it's all organic, and so if you like, let's just take the meat side of the equation, because that's often where people's questions are really gearing at, is if you spent twice as much and ate half as much meat, dairy, eggs, I mean, that's like everybody's winning there. Like your health, the planetary health, the farms, the animals, the everything. And it's just like, if you were to raise that chicken you bought, are you gonna like put it into this tiny little box, and so it can't move, and so to not waste any energy on being an animal, and it'll just totally just build up its fat muscle tissue until it can't walk and falls over, and then you'll eat that? Or are you gonna like let it run around and live like a chicken? I mean, that's like animal abuse. You're not going to do that. So like, it's not to say like, oh, it costs less for us to raise animals in horrendous abusive conditions and feed them GMO soy and corn to save a few pennies. It's just like, dude, that's not, like, you need to collapse that's you doing that. And like, is that really, are you gonna, if you were confronted with what the conditions are for that animal and what was happening, and just the ecological disaster and everything that's involved, and just the abuse of farm labor and just all of it, is that what you would do? Is that like how you would raise that animal? And probably not. Like, people would just like, no, I'm gonna pay like 10% more and make the rad decision. And so yeah, it's just like it's an annoying thing of like, it's like ethics 101. It's like, okay, if you can save 20%, but you gotta like really abuse that animal and like treat your workers like shit and ruin your farm, would you do that? And it's like, yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, David. So, vision of hope. Tell me, because I know that you take quite seriously working to make the world a better place. So, what's your vision of hope as somebody who thinks about this stuff a lot and is really understands that if we're going to go someplace good, we can't go without food, right?
Yeah.
And we're
no, it's foundational, right? And I feel like, I mean, that's your number one thing. Like, when you kind of wake up to like, okay, I need to be part of the solution and stop being part of the problem. like the number one thing you can do is shift your diet. It's like immediate. You can just say, I'm going to renounce participating in this machine that's ripping the world apart. It's just a disaster on the world. It's like a big part of why we're living through the 6th great extinction event. Like I can make that immediate choice. Like I can make that today and be real. You know, there's a lot of things that are difficult to have real personal agency about. This is an immediate thing that we can immediately do. And yeah, and I think that, you know, it's disappointing that that choice isn't happening as fast as it could be. But, you know, I used to be very unconscious and laugh at people who were, you know, thinking about, you know, the plight of animals and you know, who cares about, you know, I mean, I used to have that mindset of like just not caring. And so, you know, I wasn't a bad person. I just like didn't, whatever. So just recognizing that, and that, you know, I had the good fortune of meeting some good people at the right time in my life that kind of like helped me kind of start to see things in a different way, and that it's a process, and that, you know, we just got to create a world where just as more and more of us kind of turn on to the truth of like what our diet and agriculture need to transition to help people connect that, you know, collapse the distance. And that, I mean, unfortunately, people are disconnected from where food comes from, disconnected from nature generally, and it's a big part of the problem, and we need to reconnect them. And that's a process, and I wish it could happen faster, but, you know, one of the big strategies I personally have and others have, and Michael Pollan, I think, doesn't quite connect them explicitly, but I think it's in part of his motivation around integration of plant medicines and psychedelics is to help shift people's consciousness to think about their food in the way, you know, he's such an articulate advocate for. And so that's where we're putting a lot of our resources, is trying to shift people kind of upstream of a lot of the social and environmental problems we've got. It's like, you got to get people to kind of heal up and open their hearts and minds and start to think about and grapple with these problems in a real way. And as that happens, hopefully, you know, more and more people will start to, you know, understand the connection of diet and agriculture and environment and climate and poverty, and, you know, just how it all goes together. And so, yeah, and that, you know, we were just talking about the 60s and just all the hope and ferment and just how quick people were hoping it was just around the corner. That, you know, utopia, you know, heaven on earth. But I think that in geological time, things are happening, and, you know, obviously we're running against the clock, but I think that's kind of part of our process, is we kind of probably do need to run into some pretty dire, situations to really wake up collectively. But I think that the more and more of us that can kind of do the preparatory work, so like when maybe a triggering event really does trigger people, like we do have the knowledge and the models there ready to go to really, you know, kind of go to that global level. Yeah, and it's just a, you know, a generational thing, and we just got to keep moving, you know, keep on moving. And, you know, we can keep on making the progress and the shifts. And even though there's like just, oh my gosh, you know, the news of late has been pretty disheartening. But, you know, just kind of keep your focus on the good stuff. And, you know we're on the path. And at some point, I mean, more and more people are joining the ship. There's, you know, sophisticated corporate marketing and PR, appealing and confusing people and bamboozling people, but I think there's a solid core. And yeah, I'm optimistic that, you know, we're the spear point, and you know, we maybe not that big of a percent yet of the global agriculture and diet, but it's a powerful seed that is growing. And yeah, just keep tending it and watering that garden and taking care of our gardens and modeling it. And yeah, I think soon, hopefully sooner than later, more people will be, wow, that's a rad garden. Oh, I want a garden like that. No. No.
David, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. You always give me a little bit of more hope. So Yeah, it's a great pleasure. So keep going.
Yeah, thank you, Dave.
All right.
Yeah, you too. I am.
Thank you for listening to the Real Organic Podcast. Our movement is growing because you're subscribing and sharing these podcasts with your friends. So keep it up and leave us a rating and a review as well so that others can find us. You can find a video version of this interview on our newly designed website, realorganicproject.org, or on our YouTube channel. And you can join us every Thursday for a new episode featuring voices from the organic movement. See you next time.